Her mother is Mary of Guise. They had refused to grant it, and so he had broken off connections with the Catholic Church. And this created some problems for Henry. He was very concerned that England could be invaded and by Catholic France, by Catholic Spain, in opposition to his Protestant position. And he was most concerned that a Catholic army would be landed in Scotland, and Scotland then used as a launching point for an invasion of England. And so his solution to this problem was, well, I will marry off my son Edward, who was actually the uncle of Mary, Queen of Scots. I will marry my son Edward off to Mary, and thereby we'll fuse England and Scotland together with that union. Scottish Protestants were not opposed to this. They thought that it was a fine idea. It would help cement and help expand Protestantism's hold in Scotland. But Mary's Catholic guardians were not so intrigued by this idea. They were very concerned that Scotland would become subjugated by England, become a lesser. It was not. They did not see that this is going to be an equal partnership, but that Scotland would be put in a submissive position. And so Mary was carted around Scotland from castle to castle, trying to flee Edward VIII's pursuits. And eventually, Henry VIII's generals came up with a new strategy, and that was sort of a two-handed deal. On the one hand, extending a hand of friendship with words of fellowship, brotherhood, equality between England and Scotland, trying to court the favor of the Scottish nobles. And on the other hand, he was using the very iron fist of military might. A huge army invaded into southern Scotland, murdering and burning along the way, as armies often at that time did. Henry VIII's armies also burned and sacked Melrose Abbey and Holyrood Abbey along the way. And Scotland realized, and the Scottish nobles realized, that Scotland needed help. It was not going to be able to resist Henry VIII on their own. And so who do they turn to but Scotland's age-old support and ally, France? At this point, the French king offers to come in and support the Scots on one condition, and that is that Mary marry his son, Francois. The Scottish nobles agree to this, and so Mary is sent across to France to be raised in the royal French court. There's the two of them together. One of the residences is Chateau de Chambord, Chateau Chenonceau, and the Chateau Amboise. These are a number of the different residences of the French royal court of where she grew up. She was raised as a daughter in the French royal court. She was raised to be the future Queen of France. She received an excellent education in literature, rhetoric, music, dancing, and sport. In stark contrast to her husband, Francois, who was short and clumsy, Mary was very tall, elegant, and charming. And she was groomed from the very beginning that not only was she Queen of Scots, but she was to be Queen of France, and perhaps queen of something more. You see, Mary contained very, very royal blood. She's not just royal blood of Scotland. She contains royal blood of England as well. Her grandmother is Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. Her prospects of inheriting the crown of England are rather slim at this time. She is fourth in line, behind Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. And events in England will take a dramatic shift that will raise Mary's prospects. Both Edward IV and Mary I, they both die without heirs. And so the question is between Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth. Well, Elizabeth is regarded as being illegitimate. She was born 8 months after her parents' marriage. For some, this is quite a bit of a problem. She's illegitimate by birth and thus illegitimate to become Queen of England. And so many, especially Catholics, see Mary, Queen of Scots as the true legitimate heir to the throne of England. However, Elizabeth has one thing going for her, or a couple things going for her, and that is she's English, she's a Tudor, and for many in England, she's also Protestant. And so the decision is to give the crown of England to Elizabeth. And so this dream of having a massive united Catholic empire that would stretch from Scotland to England over to France is dashed when Elizabeth takes the throne. Mary, throughout her life, is much of a Greek tragedy. And that tragedy will start with the death of her husband, Francois. He dies of an ear infection, and this leaves Mary a widow. They did not have any children, and so this leaves her a widow. She is a powerless dowager queen. And so with the death of Francois, Mary, Queen of Scots, will begin to look to home, will look back to Scotland. Her mother, who had been reigning in Scotland as a regent, Mary of Guise, died in 1560. And so Scotland, in need of a monarch, calls and invites Mary, Queen of Scots, to come back home and to be their queen. Now, at this time, however, things in Scotland were a bit unsettled. There had been a Protestant Reformation in Scotland, and with little bloodshed in comparison to some places like England and France. The leader, or one of the key leaders of the Scottish Reformation, is John Knox. He triggered a rebellion against Mary's mother, Mary of Guise. And the Protestants, although with little bloodshed, had driven the Roman Catholics to power. And there is a question regarding as to what the religious future of Scotland will be. For individuals such as Knox, Mary is disqualified from being queen. She's a woman, sorry to say, but she is. And she's Catholic. She's personally Catholic. And so that will exclude her from, in John Knox's eyes, from taking the throne. Some Scottish nobles, there are Catholics who want her to reign as a Catholic and drive out the Protestants. There are other Scottish nobles who are Protestants, including Mary's half-brother, who are wanting her to cooperate with the new Protestant religion. And his position is, you can be a Catholic in private so long as you allow a tolerance of religion, a tolerance of Protestantism to thrive in Scotland. And so, pressed between these two positions to uphold and advance a very strong Catholic Scotland or a more moderate, religiously tolerant Scotland, Mary chooses to allow for Protestantism to survive, to thrive, although she herself will remain a Catholic in private.
Dr. Lay,
yes.
Who was her half-brother?
James Stuart, the Earl of Moray. In August of 1561, Mary will sail back into Scottish waters, and she will hold her first private mass at Holyrood. Oops. There we go. It's not real clear in this photograph, but Holyrood Palace is right here. This is the east end of Edinburgh. That's the west end towards Edinburgh Castle is up here. This is one of the main streets, Princes Street, in Scotland, or in Edinburgh, excuse me. And so she will hold her first Mass, private Mass, at Holyrood. John Knox, again, this fiery Protestant preacher in Edinburgh, argues that one Mass was more fearful than an army of 10,000 if a 10,000-man army had landed in the realm. And from the pulpit of St. Giles, he openly preached against her. Knox was ultimately brought before the Queen to explain himself. There he is, John Knox. And straight to her face, he challenged her right to rule. One, she was a Catholic. Scotland is not Catholic in his eyes. And two, of course, she's a woman. And in his eyes, that her gender excludes her from reigning as a monarch. Mary faced him down and said that Scotland could remain Protestant. She wasn't going to outlaw the religion or take action against the religion, but she herself, in private, would remain a Catholic. And so despite these disagreements, Scotland's changeover and shift in religious disputes would remain relatively bloodless in comparison to other places. Surviving that first crisis, Mary set about the task of actually ruling the country. She correctly believed that when push came to shove, the Scottish nobility would support her because she was a Stuart, and that they would overlook and minimize and not elevate her issue of her being a Catholic in an increasingly Protestant country. So she traveled around the country, gaining support, and really charmed the Scottish nobility to come to her side and support her as a monarch, even though she's Catholic, and many of them were Protestants. She does do a successful job in charming them and pulling them over to her side. Now, from the time that she was 6 days old, Mary had been Queen of Scotland. She had been groomed and bred in the French courts to think of herself as something more. And so there's always this burning question that Mary has to struggle with and work through in terms of, can she be satisfied being a monarch, being a queen of a rather backwater spot in Europe? Scotland is not, it's a beautiful country, but it's not the leading, most glamorous country in which to be a monarch. England is a much bigger prize. France is a much bigger prize, and the tragedy of her life has excluded her from France. And so now there's this question: can she be satisfied as Queen of Scotland, or how is she going to push her claim and advance? And will she need to want the throne of England? Now, England, of course, had already had their leading lady, Elizabeth. They were quite satisfied with her. But by 1564, Elizabeth had neither married and had not produced an heir, and she would not marry and would not produce an heir. And so Mary Stuart set about taking the initiative in this way. She begins surveying the field for a number of potential and suitable suitors. She considered Henri, the Duke of Anjou. He was the brother of Francois II, so that could be a potential match. Another prospect was Don Carlos of Spain, although he went mad, and so that kind of excluded him from the running. Both of these two individuals, they're both Catholic. Queen Elizabeth of England had her pick that she threw at Mary, and that was Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. But what Mary wanted, she wanted a stud. She wanted someone that would improve the bloodline, improve and advance her claim, potentially advance her claim on the throne of England. And so she set her eyes on Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Now, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, is actually her first cousin by half. This is the connection between Mary Queen of Scots and Stuart Darnley. They have the same grandmother, different grandfathers. So they are first cousins, or they're half first cousins. They also connect back up here with Mary Stuart, and in fact, they both have the same. They trace further back in the Stuart line. So they're multiple places their lines intersect. Yes.
The spelling of Stuart and Stuart, are they really the same place? Or?
It's the same. It's the same. In the case of Mary Queen of Scots, down until her father, it's spelled Stewart. When Mary Queen, it's a great question. When Mary Queen of Scots is relocated over to France, she changes the spelling of her last name to Stuart. In French, so I'm told, this spelling of Stuart would be pronounced Stuvart. There'd be a V in the pronunciation, and so in order to maintain the purity of the pronunciation, she changes the name to the French spelling. It's the exact same family. Different parts or different elements of the family will change the spelling on different occasions. But that's a great question, because it can be confusing in terms of same family, different family. Nope, same family. Different branches of the family, but still same family.
Dr. Lay, I do have a question about the Earl of Dudley. Was he involved with Elizabeth at any point?
Yes.
And so she thought maybe, okay, gotcha. Why she was, plus if she could get rid of him over there and keep everything under wraps.
Yeah. Now, Henry Stuart is, I'll go back up here. Henry Stuart was a charming individual. She didn't know him all that well. Mary had only actually met him twice for not long periods of time. He was considered to be a good dancer, a good huntsman. He was tall, he was young, he was dashing. And so the two of them married on 17th of February, 1565. Now, Darnley was a rather cocky 19-year-old at the time, and he was not satisfied to merely being Mary's husband. He wanted to be granted the title of King of Scotland. And Darnley would roam around Edinburgh, bemoaning the fact that he was not king. He was rather drunk, rather debauched individual, and was very good at making many personal enemies at the time because of his demeanor, because of his actions, and just was not a pleasant individual to be around, and he rubbed people the wrong way. On the 19th of June, 1566, guns were fired all across the country, not as part of war, but in celebration of the birth of the future heir, James VI. A few months after his birth, a ceremony was held in Stirling Castle. A couple different shots of the castle. This great hall, by the way, has just been completely renovated, and so it's back the way it used to look at this time. They've done a spectacular job at that. That's the inside of that great hall. A few months later, he was baptized in Stirling Castle. And this was a major political event at the time. Ambassadors from surrounding countries were there. There was, as a part of the ceremony, a round table was put out for people to sit around, and James was heralded and called Little Arthur, referencing back to King Arthur of Camelot. And he was referred to as, and talked quite openly as being the future king of a united Britain. Now, this did not sit well with the English. They didn't like this upstart type of discussion, but really, James is, by all intents and purposes, the only and really the next legitimate heir of England, whether England liked it or not. He was the next in line. He was the closest blood relative to assume that title. So, like it or not, the English realized that where this would leave England was it would leave England in Scottish hands. A Scot would become king of England someday, so long as, all things being considered, that was the trajectory of where things were going. Elizabeth had long feared Mary and her potential claims on the throne, but at this point, Elizabeth seems prepared to do something quite remarkable, and that is recognize James VI as her legitimate heir. That situation will change, however, because of Mary's poor choice in men, unfortunately. Henry Stuart will be murdered in 1567. He was suffering from either smallpox, probably smallpox, possibly syphilis, but we think most people assume, or most of the discussion is that it was smallpox that he was suffering from at the time. So he was not staying in the palace, but he was staying in a house called Kirker Fields. Well, his enemies decided that this was a grand time to get rid of him. They packed the basement full of gunpowder and were intending to blow the house and Lord Darnley up and get rid of this annoyance in their life. Well, the house was exploded when investigators arrived at the scene to take stock of the situation. They found Lord Darnley dead, along with one of his servants. Unfortunately, or as it turned out, there was no sign of that he had been killed in the explosion. It is believed that he was either suffocated, most likely suffocated trying to get out of the house by those that were intending to assassinate him. And it led to significant questions as who was responsible. Certainly it was most likely someone of some standing, but exactly who was not yet determined. And some were saying that Mary herself was behind this plot to get rid of her, rid of this nuisance in her life. Mary's actions after the fact would not do much to quell that suspicion. She didn't rush into mourning clothes. Lord Darnley was somewhat unceremoniously buried at Holyrood Abbey, merely just dumped there. There's no marker. There's no tombstone or any indication as to where he's buried. He just was dropped off. No one really cared that Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was dead. People just weren't, it wasn't an issue. But because of Mary's actions, suspicion began to direct in her direction towards, was she somehow involved? Did she somehow know about the plot? Did she somehow orchestrate the plot? She herself was not there at the time. She was at a wedding reception elsewhere. She had been to that house earlier in the day.
Dr. Lay, was she at this time involved with James Hepburn, who was Lord Bothwell?
We're getting there. One of those that was suspected of being involved was James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. And Mary doesn't help herself out because in this regard, in that shortly after Lord Darnley is assassinated, she marries James Hepburn. And this immediately begins thinking, well, what's going on here? You're marrying the person that many were at least assuming was involved in some way, shape, or form. It was never proven. We don't know, for instance, we don't know for sure what his involvement was, whether he was or was not aware of it. We don't even know for sure whether Mary herself was somehow involved, although there is some indication that she was, although it's disputed. Henry's death changed a great deal for Mary and changed a great deal for James, her son. Elizabeth, until things were sorted out regarding the death of Henry Stuart, Elizabeth refused to recognize James as her heir. And that wasn't likely to happen until things were cleaned up. And again, with Mary marrying James Hepburn, that's only raising further suspicions of what's going on here. Sensing a weakness with growing questions about her culpability, Protestant nobles rise up, being spurred on by John Knox. And Scotland will teeter on the brink of civil war. Now, to avoid bloodshed, Mary offers herself up into captivity. James Hepburn goes into exile off to Denmark, and he'll spend the last 10 years of his life chained to a stone pillar in prison in Denmark. He will end up losing his mind because of that. Very tragic for him. And Mary, Queen of Scots, will be sent off, and she will be imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, which is on this little tiny island in this middle of the loch. And there it is. Imprisoned there, she will be presented with documents for her to sign, which will abdicate the throne in favor of her infant son, James. At first, she will refuse to do so, but realizing that she has very few options at this point, she eventually does sign, gives up her power in favor of her infant son, James. A few months later, Mary will escape from Loch Leven. She will make an effort to try to get her power back, but defeated, Mary will flee to England, where she will once again essentially be put in prison. She's essentially put under house arrest by Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth does this. She doesn't trust Mary. She can't have Mary running around the country. Mary is intending to go to England, try to raise support from outside of Scotland, and then return, but is imprisoned by Elizabeth, who doesn't trust her cousin at all.
So, excuse me, so
Yes.
Elizabeth is Mary's cousin?
Yes. Yep, they're cousins. So what of the minority of James VI? James VI, for the first time, a Scottish king is crowned in a Protestant ceremony. His mother is still alive. She's essentially, for much of his life, James, after 1567, James never sees his mother again. He is purposefully, she's in England, first of all, but there is every effort made to make sure that he is raised and brought up Protestant, that he is not brought up Catholic. He is crowned in a Protestant ceremony. He is educated by Protestants. He is groomed to be a Protestant king and take Scotland in a Protestant direction. They've had enough of Catholics, especially those that are influencing him at this time and in control of him. The education of young James will be put in the hands of this individual, George Buchanan. It's up to George Buchanan to ensure that James is properly raised a Protestant. He is drilled on the limitations of royal authority. He is groomed and instructed that the role of the monarch is under review, and it's the will of the people that mattered, not his personal interests or desires. Indeed, he is taught and instructed that if he rules as a tyrant, he can expect the people to justifiably remove him as a monarch. This is what he is taught. This is what he is groomed and told by George Buchanan.
So this is back to that business where if you don't, if they can fall back on that premise that you once discussed about if you're not doing what's best for us, then we get
Yes.
you and choose another thing.
Exactly. It's in that same kind of in that same kind of thread. Exactly. Those instructions and those lessons will come with a very poignant example. Growing up, one of James's associates was a French cousin, Esme Stuart, and the two of them were quite close. And James will bestow upon Esme titles, positions. In fact, he will elevate him over other Scottish nobles. And this does not sit well. Esme is a Catholic, and he's French. 2 strikes. Third strike is that Esme Stuart shows that he has a great deal of influence over James. And so those around James who are responsible for his care and his guardianship, essentially, worry that their influence is slipping away and that James will more and more be looking to the support and advice and comradeship of Esme. So Esme will be forced to return back to France, and James will be put into captivity. Things are not, I mean, it's a very rough childhood. His mother is taken off, she's in prison, he's in prison, or essentially in house arrest. I mean, it's not in a prison cell, but he's being controlled and manipulated.
Lords, now you, at this point, what lords are involved in this? Do they don't have a parliamentary system at this point, or do they have a House of Lords, or what do they have that are going to be able to rule him, rule in his place, but with him just as a figurehead for that time?
Part of it is essentially his uncle, James Stuart, the Earl of Moray, is ruling as a regent in his name, and other nobles that he is basically in the control. I mean, he's a minor. He's 12, 13 years old or so at the time. And so he is in the hands and guardianship of senior members of his family or other significant dukes and earls within the Scottish royal court. In 1583, James will escape. He will raise an army of supporters and will take full control of the hands and control of the government himself. At the time, he is 17 years old. Now, James, in taking control of affairs, will quickly show what kind of a ruler he intends to be. He bans all the writings of his instructor, George Buchanan. James makes it quite clear that he is not going to be ruled by the will of the people. He will be ruled and guided by God alone, and he is to rule as an absolute monarch. But what of England at this time? England is facing another war with France. It is going to seek an alliance with Scotland in support of that war. And James will have a price for Scotland's alliance, participation, and support of England. And his price will be, you must recognize me as your heir. Let's get this done with. Let's get this in writing to ensure that there's no question after your death that I am, in fact, your heir. Elizabeth won't go so far as to sign off on that, but she does extend some bonds of friendship between England and Scotland. And that friendship will soon be put to the test. After 19 years in prison, Mary, Queen of Scots, grows restless. She, at this point, has lost everything that she had once hoped for. No longer Queen of Scots, Queen of France. That dream was long dead. The dream of creating a widespread Catholic empire, creating of her taking the throne of England, that all these dreams that she had, that she had been bred, that she had been taught and instructed to believe in from a very young child, all of these dreams had been dashed. And it's at this point that she is invited to join a plot against Elizabeth. Spain, who is Catholic, was intending upon landing an invasion army in southern England, marching on London, executing Elizabeth, and it was their intention to put Mary, Queen of Scots, in Elizabeth's place. Now, this was, at the time, nothing short of a Catholic holy war. The Catholics, regarded Elizabeth as illegitimate, and therefore was someone to be righteously and deliberately replaced as a monarch. Mary's acceptance of this deal was intercepted, and Mary will be put on trial for treason and convicted and sentenced to be executed. This leaves a very big question for James. What does he do? Does he go so far as to pull all the stops to try to prevent the execution? That has potential blowback. If he does that, Elizabeth might write him off as her heir. He doesn't want that to happen. If he does nothing to help to try to save his mother, then he risks Scottish nobles rising up in opposition to him for being a weak king, for not defending his mother, for not defending an individual who they would see as a rightful heir, rightful Queen of Scots. Even though she was deposed, she was still, we're still a member of the Scottish royal family, and you can't have a member of the Scottish royal family executed without some sort of a protest. And so James is sort of stuck between these two options. And he settles upon a middle ground. He sends ambassadors down to London to plead for his mother's life. He will suggest that she be merely exiled, not executed, but exile. Exile her out of Britain, exile her to France, to Spain, wherever. Don't kill her. But he also tells his ambassadors, don't do anything, don't go so far, and don't do anything that will jeopardize my claim to the throne. It becomes clear that James is not going to go to war to save his mother. Mary will go to her death dressed as a Catholic martyr. She shows up at the execution site wearing a black gown, underneath which she is wearing a vibrant red dress, a sign of a martyr. She sees herself and is depicting herself as a martyr. She is denied a Catholic priest at the execution. In fact, it's a Protestant who is presiding over the affair and praying for her soul and offering her some consolation. And she says, look, I'm quite happy, I'm quite comfortable in my own faith as a Catholic. Thank you very much. I don't need your support right now. Throughout the entire ordeal, she conducts herself with grace, with dignity, and is to the very end acting as a queen should. In fact, she, as in her last statement, she thanks the executioners for putting an end to her troubles, and that she hopes that this will alleviate her troubled life and the problems in which she has been embroiled in. So the very dignity of the woman in her passing. Now, James expected Elizabeth to return the favor by recognizing him as the heir to the throne. I didn't put up a case. I didn't go to war over trying to save my mother. Can I get some some respect here and some recognition that I am the next in line. Well, Elizabeth doesn't do that. And so James sets about proving himself that he is the best, just the most logical choice by bloodline, but he is the most logical choice just in terms of his conduct and proving himself as a monarch. He first goes about by improving his bloodline. He marries Anne of Denmark, and in 1565 they are joined by first Henry, and in 1600 they are blessed with another son, Charles. In addition to establishing himself as not only am I fit to rule as King of England, I also have two potential heirs that can serve after me. So there's no question in terms of continuing on the dynasty here. James will also prove himself a fitting, capable monarch through a great deal of cleverness. James will stabilize Scotland, which is turbulent at this time, through words. He commissions Machiavelli's book, The Prince, to be published in Scots. And The Prince by Machiavelli is essentially a textbook on how princes, how rulers effectively rule. The getting, the keeping, the using of power, and how to keep that power. It advises monarchs and advises princes and rulers to act as a fox and a lion. Use stealth, use cleverness, and also use strength where needed, but to act appropriately and cunningly to advance their own power and to effectively govern the country.
What year was Mary executed?
She was executed in 1567.
And was she known as Bloody Mary?
No. Bloody Mary is Mary I, Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's half-sister. Now, James gradually established himself as a king who ruled by his head, not his heart. He was the very opposite of his mother. Yet he was just as ambitious as Mary was when it came to thinking big and thinking bigger. It soon became clear that even though Elizabeth never officially recognized James as the heir to the throne, that statement became irrelevant. It was quite clear that James was the next in line. He was an effective ruler, proven that in Scotland. He was blood. He had proven that he could extend the dynasty. He was of the right gender. He was of the right religion. He was Protestant. All that remained for James was to outlive Elizabeth. Yet Elizabeth lived on and on and on. In fact, Elizabeth I lived longer than any previous monarch in England. And when she died in 1603, she was 70 years old and had reigned for 45 years. So in 1603, James inherits the throne of England. He is now both King of Scots and King of England, two separate titles. He is encouraged, upon hearing the news that Elizabeth died, he is encouraged by the English nobility, you must come to London immediately in order that we can properly coronate you and you can get down to business of ruling the country.
Dr. Lake,
Yes.
did England already had hold of Ireland? Did it
Yes.
not?
Mhm.
So he was king of all three at that point?
Yes. You can tell that by looking at the coat of arms here. James goes from this coat of arms, which symbolizes the royal house of Scotland. This these arms will be used regardless as which family is actually in power. Balliol uses this arm, Bruce uses this arm, and the Stuarts will all use this arm, even though it extends all the way back to the House of Dunkeld. So it's the Stuarts would have their own family coat of arms, but when they switched over to become royalty, they moved and switched over to this one. When James becomes King of England, he combines the Royal House of Scotland and the arms of the House of Tudor in this fashion. In Scotland, he would use these, which emphasize the Scottish element. When he's in England, he would use these two, which emphasize the English component with Scotland in the upper corner here. Now, James was encouraged to show up in London immediately with all due haste, and James is like, yeah, no, I'm going to take my time. There's no big rush for me to get down there. He puts together a full entourage assemblage, nobility, courtiers, all the supporting people, and goes down there in royal pomp and circumstance. He was going to enjoy this moment that Scottish kings could only have dreamed could one day happen. A Scottish takeover of England, a Scottish monarch in charge, duly King of England. For centuries, they had been the footstool of England. English kings had tried to subjugate them, and here we have a Scottish noble sitting on the throne of England. In Scotland, James VI, or James I, as he would be known in England, was one of Scotland's most accomplished monarchs. So he's no rookie when he takes the throne. He knows what he's doing. He's proven it in Scotland. One of the first things that he will do upon taking the throne is he will commission a tomb for Queen Elizabeth and her sister Mary Tudor in Westminster Abbey. He'll spend £765 for their tomb. Having done that, he also saw to the task of appropriately burying his mother in Westminster Abbey. Mary, after her execution, was buried in Peterborough Cathedral. James will bring his mother's body to Westminster and put a very elaborate, there she is, with a Scottish lion at her feet. For his mother's tomb, James will spend £2,000. He is making it very clear in this statement that he believes that his mother had been unjustly treated, something he had to be cautious about prior to her death. He is now making a full statement. We're undoing all those wrongs by appropriately burying her in grandeur in Westminster Abbey. She is buried, in fact, directly across from her cousin Elizabeth. This is the tomb of Mary, Queen of Scots, and across the aisle on the other side is the tomb of Elizabeth I and Mary I. Only Elizabeth has a marble effigy, but both of them are buried there together. In fact, they're not buried here, they're actually buried below, in vaults below the floor. Having done that, James, in meeting with the English Parliament, reveals his grand master plan. He envisions the creation of a new country, a Great Britain, with common law, common religion, and common citizenship. Up until this point, England and Scotland are only united in his person. Otherwise, they're two separate countries. They're only united in his person. James envisions bringing both countries more solidly together with one government, one system of law, and one religion. he sees it as expanding. He sees Scotland and England as equals, co-equal partnership in this new country of Great Britain. Now, the English nobility, they're asking themselves the question, what is so equal about England and Scotland? England's bigger, England's richer, England is more cultured. England, in every measurable instance, is Scotland superior? Why should we act in a way or take steps in a way that would effectively make the two countries equal? What is so beneficial about joining with what they would consider backward Scots? Now, James, however, is determined to pursue this. He takes the idea to Parliament. It doesn't go over exactly so well with the English Parliament. In fact, he gets firm resistance. And they were not going to roll over just because he asked them to. And they certainly were not going to roll over for an upstart Scot, newly appointed and duly appointed king, but still, he is Scottish, and they're not just going to give in just because you're the king now. James soon finds that he has other problems that he has to deal with. Outside of Parliament, relations between the Scots and English are reaching a breaking point. Something is going to happen. James begins elevating Scots, surrounding his closest court members with Scots. He begins elevating them, giving them new titles, higher titles, gives them money, gives them land, and this begins to rub the English the wrong way. They begin to be pushed aside he is Scottish and he's bringing his Scottish court down, but from the English perspective, he is playing favorites. This prominence that the Scots begin to have in London and surrounding James will lead to one of the most spectacular conspiracies in British history, the Gunpowder Plot. Now, one group, above all, began to really have it out for James, and those were English Catholics. They didn't just like the fact that they were being pushed aside because they were English. They also felt that James was not treating them as well as he could. He wasn't purging them, but they still didn't think that they were being treated equally or equally enough. They thought he was too Protestant. James himself sort of is having to walk a fine line. He doesn't want to anger either group, and so he'll give concessions to Protestants, he'll give concessions to Catholics, but the Catholics felt that he was bending too far over for the Protestants.
Did Elizabeth do that, or did she just ignore the whole thing? Did she have to walk that
She
line?
did have to walk it a bit, although she did lean more towards the Protestants, in part because the Catholics regarded her as illegitimate. So that, in and of itself, will force her to side more with Protestants than Catholics, although Elizabeth's own perspective is, can't we all just get along? Elizabeth herself was Protestant, and she wasn't going to take direct action against Catholics, but she still had to kind of be careful and walk a fine line that she wouldn't ruffle too many feathers. Either way, over time, her reign as queen became more and more secure, especially early on. She's got to watch it because she's young, she's is unproven, and there is always a threat that Spain or France will come in with an invasion force and kick her off the throne, and she's got Mary, Queen of Scots, that she has to deal with. English Catholics felt that James had let them down, that he was giving them empty promises of tolerance. And so a group of English Catholics conspired against him, including one individual by the name of Guy Fawkes. Now, Guy Fawkes and his associates, there's about 10 or 11 of these men, decide the best way to solve the situation is by getting rid of James. And so they will pack, they're expecting James to be delivering a speech in Parliament, and in preparation for that, they will pack the vaults underneath the Houses of Parliament with gunpowder, intending to blow him up when he comes to give his address. Their target is not the institution of Parliament or even the building. They just see it as the best way of getting at James when he is perhaps least protected, or at least he's coming into a venue that they can manipulate for their own advances. Now, after the plot was foiled, it was soon discovered that it wasn't just James that they were targeting. In fact, detailed maps marking the residence for every prominent Scot in London were also going to be targeted. This is essentially genocide of a sort, an ethnic cleansing of London from Scottish nobles and those around James. Fortunately for James, the plot was discovered the night before James was supposed to show up at Parliament. The conspirators were tracked down, arrested, and executed for treason. And today, November 5th, Guy Fawkes Day, is celebrated as the survival of Parliament. It's very much celebrated in the same way that we would celebrate 4th of July. Fireworks, bonfires, people will string up effigies of Guy Fawkes, hang them up and celebrate in due fashion. Now, the prospect for a peaceful, united Britain at this time was in desperate trouble. In the absence of any meaningful progress, Parliament, they're not going to go anywhere near rewriting laws and restructuring the country to allow for a creation of Great Britain. And so James had to resort to symbols, to gestures, to flags. Once James had gone to London, there's Guy Fawkes planting some gunpowder beneath Parliament. Once James got to London, he commissioned some London officials, English officials, to design a new flag for his country, that he is monarch of both, a symbol that will represent both countries. The initial design that this Englishman came up with was to do that. We're going to put Scotland in one corner of the English flag, and then the design would be thus. The Scots, of course, were not at all pleased by this design. This was, in fact, they were very fearful by this symbol. This signified England is the dominant partner. Scotland, you're just a small corner. You don't matter much. You're not equal to us. And they were fearful that James was going to sign away Scottish independence, Scottish identity with one stroke of the pen. Instead of this design, James chose a different design. He chose the Cross of St. George imposed upon Scotland's Cross of St. Andrews. This was to be his symbol. It was essentially a way of equalizing the two countries in one. One is not greater than the other, although the English Cross of St. George is on top. You will occasionally see designs where the Cross of St. Andrews is on top of the Cross of St. George. Those flags were could be flown across the border in Scotland, showing, no, we're on top of you. But essentially this is equating the two. One is not inferior, one's not smaller, one's not greater. They're essentially equal. But throughout James's lifetime, this flag will only be a symbol of what a formal union could be and could look like. It went no further than this. In James's time, the people of Britain, both English and Scottish, they weren't ready to be British. They still had very strong senses of who they were as independent people. For centuries, English kings had tried to subjugate Scotland, and it's one of the great ironies then that it would be a Scottish king and a Scottish family that would come to rule over Britain or over England. Yes?
So his vision, did he have both the English and the Scots against his vision?
To some degree, yes. The Scots were afraid that although James becomes King of England, in a sense they lose part of him. He's in London, he never goes back to England, or never goes back north to Scotland after 1603. They see him being overwhelmed, more and more a part of English trappings, English throne, England's bigger, he becomes more involved in English affairs, and they see that they are losing a sense of their monarch in this personal union of the monarch. So there is a sense that the Scots aren't, they see that there's questions to be had about formalizing a union. To have it separate, they would retain their own independent kingdom, ruled by James or his descendants, but nevertheless, we have ourselves our own kingdom. The English had their own kingdom. The Scots in 1603 still had a very strong, even stronger sense of who they were in their culture, in their kingdom. They had been proven unconquerable by a series of successive invaders had come in and tried to subjugate them, but they had maintained their independence. And the events of 1603 were not, it was a turning point for Scotland in terms of its relationship and its character and the standing of Scotland as a kingdom. The peace that came about with James taking the throne in 1603, the promise of that peace would be short-lived. In the century to come, Scotland and England will experience a series of serious escalations of violence. A furious civil war will break out over the questions of how to resolve just what it means to be British and what does Britain mean, and to determine just what sort of country Scotland could and should become. So that's where when we come back on Thursday, we'll be looking at Scotland amidst religious turmoil, amidst look at the outbreak of the English Civil War and Scotland's role and participation in the English Civil War, and what that does for the nature, the religious nature, the political nature of Scotland moving forward into the 1600s. So, any questions?
Was James at all involved with any of the American exploration?
Yes, in the sense that Jamestown is named after him. Charleston, South Carolina is named after his son Charles. So he is involved and invested in overseas colonizing of America. That's happening at the same time. Even before with Elizabeth, Sir Walter Raleigh had established a colony at Roanoke, which disappeared. But it's under James and his successors that colonization of America picks up, and with a more concerted effort along the way.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's nothing to do with Scotland, but it's got something to do with Ireland. Was James, I read something about a plantation of Ulster.
Yes.
Was Ulster already, Ulster was already there, but was James the king that was able to, let's say, plant more people from Scotland and England over into Ireland than any other at that time?
James picks up, in regards to transplanting English and largely Scottish individuals over to Ireland, James picks up where Henry VIII and Elizabeth took off. They had already been doing it, and James does it even more, of offering land to Scottish nobles or English nobles, and populating and subjugating. Ulster is the northeast province of Ireland, and so most of the Protestants that move into Ireland will move and focus in that area. It's the historical background for why Northern Ireland's boundary is drawn where it is. It's because that's where most of the Protestants live in that part through the plantation of Ulster.
Was it just Northern Ireland that they settled with Scottish people, or was it other parts of?
They were doing it elsewhere as well. Ulster is where the vast majority of the that's where the Protestants had a majority in terms of Catholic Protestant divide. If you broke down the whole island of Ireland and created a map based upon religious density, the area of Ulster, or which is now mostly Northern Ireland, that would have been where there was a concentration of Protestants. When they created what is Northern Ireland, they did not include all of Ulster. They purposely left 2 counties out in order to ensure that Northern Ireland would have a Protestant majority. So they're playing politics. They're gerrymandering. They're certainly gerrymandering that border of Northern Ireland to protect and preserve that Northern Ireland would be governable by a Protestant majority. If they didn't take out those 2 counties, there'd be a Catholic majority in Ulster. But by taking out those 2 counties, they were able to ensure that there would be a Protestant majority in Ulster.
He was responsible for the translation of the Protestant Bible, King James.
Yes. Yes, it's that King James.
My question too is, I've always heard about the border lords. Because they were such a problem going back and forth, did he get rid of some of these problem people by sending them over to Ireland?
That I would have to look up. I don't know that right offhand. It wouldn't surprise me if he did. But I can't say for sure that whether or not, if he actually did that or not. Yes?
But